For the better part of a century, three companies have effectively owned the sky: Rolls-Royce, GE Aerospace, and Pratt Whitney. Every major commercial jet engine, every long-haul flight, every dollar flowing through that supply chain has run through one of those three names. But something is genuinely shifting right now, and it's happening considerably faster than most Western analysts originally expected. China just unveiled the CJ-2000. And this isn't some minor copycat side project buried in a research paper somewhere. This represents China's first real, serious attempt at controlling the single most powerful and most profitable piece of aviation technology ever built, the jet engine itself. So how exactly did China go from simply buying Western engines off the shelf to attempting to build one capable of eventually replacing them entirely? Let's actually break this down properly. COMAC, the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, spent well over a decade developing the C919, the aircraft widely positioned as China's answer to Boeing and Airbus. A genuinely domestic aircraft, built inside China, funded by Chinese capital, proudly marketed with a Made in China label attached to it. And when it finally entered commercial service, the world genuinely took notice. But pop open the metaphorical hood on that aircraft, and here's exactly what you actually find sitting at its core. A CFM LEAP 1C engine, French and American technology, built through a joint venture between America's GE and France's Safran. So yes, technically, the airframe itself is Chinese, the wings are Chinese, the fuselage is Chinese, but the heart of the machine, the actual engine, is not. Stop and really think about what a jet engine actually represents within the broader context of an aircraft. It isn't simply one component sitting among many others. It's typically the single most expensive individual part of the entire aircraft, frequently accounting for somewhere around 30% of the total build cost. It's also the most mechanically complex object found anywhere in commercial aviation, containing thousands of precision-engineered parts, many of them operating at sustained temperatures that actually exceed the melting point of the very metal alloys they're constructed from. And on top of all that, it happens to be the single most tightly controlled, most heavily restricted piece of technology anywhere in the entire aerospace supply chain. You genuinely cannot simply buy one at a discount somewhere. You cannot realistically reverse engineer your way around the underlying engineering. You either possess the technology outright, or you remain permanently dependent on someone else who does. And here's exactly where this entire situation becomes genuinely uncomfortable for Chinese planners. Think back to 2022, when the United States began systematically cutting off China's access to advanced semiconductor technology through export controls, formal blacklisting, and a wide range of other targeted restrictions. Almost overnight, entire major Chinese technology companies found themselves effectively locked out of the specialized computer chips they desperately needed simply to keep functioning. Huawei, SMIC, and dozens of other major firms all felt the impact directly and immediately. The underlying message from Washington was unmistakably clear at the time. If your technology base depends fundamentally on ours, we retain meaningful control over your future. Now, genuinely ask yourself the obvious follow-up question. What happens if Washington eventually decides to play that exact same card with jet engines specifically? Suddenly, every single C919 currently sitting on a Chinese runway becomes something closer to a giant question mark hanging over the entire program. Every future flight plan, every planned fleet expansion, every pending airline order, all of it ultimately hinges on whether the United States government decides to keep that particular supply chain open indefinitely. That's not some abstract, purely hypothetical scenario dreamed up for dramatic effect. That represents the exact same kind of real, tangible leverage that reportedly keeps senior Chinese aviation officials awake at night worrying about their own program's future. Because here's the genuinely brutal underlying truth of the entire situation. It fundamentally doesn't matter how technologically advanced your finished aircraft looks sitting on the tarmac. If someone else builds the actual engine powering it, someone else ultimately holds real power over your entire aviation industry. The airframe itself might genuinely belong to you, but the moment that critical engine supply chain gets cut off for any reason, your entire fleet is effectively grounded. And once you don't control the engine, you simply don't control the aircraft. Full stop, regardless of whose flag happens to be painted on the tail. So China looked squarely at that exact strategic vulnerability and decided to build the actual solution completely from scratch, resulting in the CJ-2000. This isn't simply an incremental upgrade to some existing engine design. This isn't a modest modification layered on top of borrowed foreign technology. This represents China's genuine ground-up attempt to independently design and build a full wide-body jet engine, precisely the category of engine used to power the largest, longest-range commercial aircraft flying anywhere in the world today. The organization actually leading this effort is AECC, the Aero Engine Corporation of China, a massive state-backed aerospace conglomerate established with essentially one core mission driving its entire existence, making China permanently engine independent once and for all. The CJ-2000 itself is reportedly designed to produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 metric tons of total thrust, which translates to roughly 78,000 to 84,000 pounds of raw force. Now, what does a figure like that actually mean in practical, tangible terms? A fully loaded Boeing 777 weighs somewhere around 700,000 pounds at the moment of takeoff. An engine class producing this level of thrust is genuinely capable of violently hurling that entire massive machine skyward using just two of these engines working together, nothing more. For useful comparison, the Rolls-Royce Trent XWB happens to be the exact engine currently powering the Airbus A350, widely considered one of the most technologically advanced long-haul commercial aircraft flying anywhere today. Similarly, the GE9X is the specific engine Boeing selected to power its next generation flagship, the 700X. Both of these particular engines are broadly regarded within the industry as representing the absolute cutting edge of modern jet engine engineering. The CJ-2000 is specifically targeting that exact same thrust category as both of these established engines. On paper, at least, it's already playing squarely within the same competitive league as the two most advanced wide-body engines currently in existence, and that fact alone is genuinely remarkable. To be clear, China isn't currently claiming this new engine outperforms a Trent XWB in raw capability right now. They aren't asserting it's already more fuel efficient than a GE9X today either. That's genuinely not the actual point of this entire program. The real point here is something considerably more strategic in nature, and frankly, considerably more concerning from the perspective of established Western aerospace manufacturers. The actual point is independence, plain and simple. Once AECC successfully builds and fields this engine, China gains complete control over the underlying design. China controls every stage of the manufacturing process. China controls every single individual component sitting inside that entire supply chain, the specialized alloys, the turbine blades, the internal cooling systems, even the embedded control software running the whole system. No American export license required at any point. No French joint venture partnership necessary. No British engineering technology embedded anywhere inside the engine's core architecture. Just China independently building and fully owning the single most critical piece of technology in all of commercial aviation entirely on its own terms, answerable to nobody else. Because realistically, you don't ultimately defeat an established competitor like Rolls-Royce simply by out-engineering them overnight in some dramatic breakthrough moment. You defeat that kind of dependency by reaching the point where you simply never need them again at all. But here's where this entire story becomes considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting to actually follow closely. Building a genuinely powerful jet engine is simply not remotely the same challenge as building a genuinely reliable one that people actually trust with their lives. There's an enormous, often overlooked gap between designing an engine that looks impressive, sitting on a technical specification sheet, and actually building one that a commercial airline pilot would confidently trust with roughly 300 passenger lives at 35,000 feet in the air. That terrifying gap separating powerful from proven happens to be exactly where the overwhelming majority of ambitious new jet engine programs throughout aviation history have historically gone to die. Rolls-Royce didn't become the globally trusted name it is today overnight, and it's worth appreciating exactly how long that particular journey actually took. This is a company carrying well over a century of accumulated engineering history behind it. Every single Trent engine currently flying commercial routes today effectively carries within it the accumulated institutional knowledge of thousands of individual failures, subsequent fixes, and genuinely hard-learned lessons absorbed over decades, many of those lessons paid for through catastrophic test cell explosions and, in some historical cases, entire grounded fleets. That kind of deep institutional knowledge simply doesn't exist neatly written down inside some engineering manual somewhere waiting to be copied. It lives instead inside the accumulated hands on experience of individual engineers who have spent their entire professional careers doing nothing else but this exact specialized work. And the underlying physics involved here are genuinely brutal to manage reliably at scale. Inside a modern high-performance jet engine, internal combustion temperatures regularly exceed 700 degrees Celsius, meaning temperatures considerably hotter than the actual melting point of the metal alloys used to construct the turbine blades themselves. Those individual blades only manage to survive under those extreme conditions through an intricate network of microscopic internal cooling channels, combined with specialized ceramic coatings so precisely engineered that they're actually grown as single continuous crystal structures inside a laboratory setting, rather than manufactured through conventional casting methods. thousands of individual precision components, machined to tolerances tighter than the width of a single human hair, all spinning together at speeds approaching 10,000 revolutions per minute, sustained continuously across millions of accumulated flight hours over the engine's operational lifetime. This is precisely where most ambitious new engine programs ultimately run into serious trouble. Not necessarily because the underlying engineering design itself was fundamentally flawed, but simply because there's genuinely no meaningful shortcut around accumulated real-world operational experience. AECC clearly understands this underlying reality, and here's what actually makes their overall strategic approach genuinely interesting to watch unfold. They aren't attempting to directly beat Rolls-Royce head-to-head in open global competition right out of the gate. Instead, they appear to be trying to outsmart the entire surrounding system itself. AECC doesn't actually need the CJ-2000 to be flawlessly perfect from day one of commercial service. They simply need it to be good enough to reliably fly domestic Chinese routes first. In an environment where Chinese regulatory bodies handle certification, Chinese domestic airlines operate the aircraft, and Chinese engineers steadily accumulate real-world flight hours. First thousands of hours, then hundreds of thousands, eventually building toward millions of cumulative flight hours over time. They genuinely aren't chasing major contracts with airlines like United sometime in 2027. They're instead quietly building an extensive operational track record inside a captive domestic market of roughly 1.4 billion people that essentially no other competing engine manufacturer can realistically touch or access. Build the program domestically first, prove reliability domestically first, then gradually scale outward toward the broader global market once that foundation is genuinely solid. That's not really a strategy built around brute force engineering superiority. That's patience being deliberately weaponized as a long-term competitive strategy instead. So let's genuinely zoom out here and look at the bigger overall picture. Because if this entire underlying strategic ecosystem actually works as intended, the resulting consequences for global commercial aviation would be absolutely enormous. Here's essentially the roadmap China appears to be quietly executing step by step. The C919 represented step one in this broader sequence, a domestic narrow-body aircraft specifically designed to prove China could actually build a genuinely competitive commercial airliner at all. The C929 represents step two in that same sequence, a full wide-body aircraft specifically designed to eventually challenge the Boeing 787 and Airbus A350 directly on lucrative international long-haul routes. And the CJ-2000, that particular engine program, functions as the actual key that unlocks the entire remaining strategy. Without a genuinely domestic engine option available, the C929 essentially remains just another airplane wearing a fundamentally Western heart underneath its Chinese exterior. But equipped with the CJ-2000 instead, it becomes something entirely different. A fully Chinese aircraft from top to bottom, spanning design, manufacturing, and complete engine supply chain, all of it owned outright by a single country with no meaningful foreign dependency remaining. Right now, global commercial aviation effectively operates under a long-standing duopoly, with Boeing and Airbus together deciding, in practical terms, what most of the world's airlines actually fly and what passengers ultimately board. That particular duopoly arrangement has held remarkably steady for decades now, largely unchallenged by any serious third competitor. But if China genuinely succeeds in fielding a competitive wide-body aircraft equipped with a fully certified domestic engine, there would suddenly exist a genuine third force within that market, one that fundamentally doesn't require Western technology to function, one that doesn't answer to Western export control restrictions at all, one capable of offering competitive aircraft to emerging markets across Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East on financing and delivery terms that Boeing and Airbus simply cannot realistically match given their own existing cost structures. That outcome wouldn't merely represent an interesting aviation industry development. That would represent a genuine geopolitical power shift, with implications extending well beyond the aerospace sector itself. But here's the necessary reality check worth applying to this entire story. And it genuinely matters for properly contextualizing everything discussed so far. The CJ-2000 engine is not currently certified for commercial service. It hasn't yet completed the extensive long-term reliability testing that regulators require before granting certification. It hasn't come remotely close to accumulating the millions of documented flight hours that both European and American aviation regulators typically demand before approving a new engine design for widespread commercial use. The C929 aircraft itself doesn't even currently have a firm, publicly confirmed launch timeline attached to it. There remain enormous, outstanding engineering challenges, substantial regulatory hurdles, and considerable geopolitical complications, still standing between where China's aerospace industry currently sits today and where it ultimately hopes to eventually arrive. Realistically, this entire process could easily take another full decade or longer to fully play out. And it's genuinely worth remembering that ambitious new engine development programs have collapsed entirely before in aviation history, including some that were remarkably well-funded and carried full government backing behind them from the very beginning. So the actual central question worth sitting with here isn't really whether China possesses the raw industrial capability to physically build a large, powerful jet engine at all. Clearly they do, and the CJ-2000's basic specifications already demonstrate that much convincingly. The real, considerably harder question is whether they can successfully build one that the broader world, meaning international regulators, international airlines, and ultimately millions of individual passengers will genuinely come to trust over time. And if that particular trust-building precedent genuinely holds over the coming decade, if those aircraft ultimately complete thousands upon thousands of safe commercial flights the way established Western engines already have, then the underlying balance of power across global commercial aviation won't simply shift gradually. It will end up being fundamentally rewritten from the ground up. It's worth actually looking closely at the graveyard of failed engine programs here, because this particular history genuinely puts the scale of China's ambition into proper perspective. Jet engine development is widely considered one of the single hardest engineering challenges in all of modern manufacturing, arguably even more difficult than building the aircraft itself. Rolls-Royce nearly went bankrupt entirely back in 1971, specifically because of cost overruns and technical failures tied to developing the RB211 engine, a program so financially catastrophic it forced the British government to nationalize the company just to keep it operating at all. Pratt Whitney's geared turbofan program, despite eventually becoming a genuine commercial success story powering the Airbus A320neo family, suffered through years of embarrassing durability issues and repeated groundings after entering service, forcing the company to spend billions of additional dollars on fixes for problems that only became apparent after the engines were already flying, paying passengers. Even General Electric, arguably the most experienced and best resourced jet engine manufacturer in the world, has had individual engine programs quietly canceled or indefinitely shelved over the decades when the underlying physics simply proved too difficult to solve economically. If companies with a full century of accumulated engineering experience behind them still regularly stumble this badly, it puts into sharp perspective just how audacious it is for AECC to attempt building a wide-body class engine essentially from a standing start, without that same century of accumulated institutional scar tissue to draw from. There's also a deeper historical irony worth pausing on here, because China isn't actually approaching this challenge from a position of pure inexperience the way it might initially appear. The country has spent decades quietly building up domestic engine expertise through its military aviation sector, developing engines for fighter jets and other combat aircraft largely outside of public view, away from the kind of international scrutiny commercial aviation programs typically attract. Those military engine programs, while operating under considerably different performance requirements and regulatory standards than commercial aviation demands, have nonetheless given Chinese engineers decades of hands-on experience working with exactly the kind of extreme temperature tolerances, precision manufacturing techniques, and advanced metallurgy that a commercial wide-body engine ultimately requires as well. The CJ-2000 isn't really emerging out of nowhere. It's emerging out of a much longer, much quieter industrial buildup that Western observers largely weren't paying close attention to until a finished commercial engine program suddenly appeared on the public radar. That semiconductor parallel mentioned earlier deserves a bit more unpacking too, because it genuinely illustrates the strategic logic driving this entire engine independence push. When the United States moved to restrict China's access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment starting in 2022, the underlying goal wasn't simply to inconvenience Chinese technology companies in the short term. It was specifically designed to exploit a genuine structural choke point, the fact that cutting-edge semiconductor fabrication depends on an extremely small handful of highly specialized companies, most of them either American or closely aligned with American export control policy. China's response to that particular choke point has been to pour enormous state resources into building domestic semiconductor manufacturing capability, with decidedly mixed results so far, hampered considerably by the sheer technical difficulty of matching decades of accumulated Western and Taiwanese manufacturing expertise in that specific field. Jet engines represent an almost identical kind of structural choke point, sitting within the aerospace industry specifically, an extremely small handful of companies controlling access to a technology that virtually the entire world's aviation industry fundamentally depends on. China's aerospace planners have clearly drawn the obvious lesson from watching the semiconductor situation unfold in real time. Better to build genuine independence proactively during a period of relative stability than to find yourself scrambling to catch up after a crisis has already hit and the technology access has already been cut off entirely. It's also worth considering what happens on the Western side of this competitive equation as this story continues developing, because Rolls-Royce, GE, and Pratt and Whitney are unlikely to simply watch passively while China works to build its own independent engine alternative. All three companies have historically responded to emerging competitive threats by accelerating their own next-generation research programs, and there's already been renewed public discussion within the industry about developing entirely new open rotor and advanced turbofan architectures specifically intended to maintain a clear technological performance gap over any potential future Chinese competitor. Whether that kind of continuous innovation race actually succeeds in keeping Western manufacturers permanently ahead, or whether it simply buys additional time before Chinese engineering eventually catches up regardless, remains one of the more genuinely uncertain open questions hanging over the entire aerospace industry's next 2 decades. There's a final piece of this puzzle worth addressing directly too, because it's easy to get swept up purely in the engineering and geopolitical drama of this story while overlooking the actual human stakes sitting underneath it. Every single one of the reliability concerns discussed throughout this breakdown ultimately traces back to one simple, unavoidable reality. A jet engine failure at cruising altitude isn't an abstract corporate embarrassment or merely a financial setback for whichever company built it. It's a genuinely life or death mechanical event happening 35,000 feet above the ground, with several hundred passengers directly depending on that engine performing flawlessly every single time across millions of accumulated flight cycles. That's precisely why global aviation safety regulators have historically been so conservative and so slow-moving when it comes to certifying entirely new engine programs. And it's exactly why AECC's stated strategy of accumulating extensive real-world flight hours within China's own domestic market first, before ever attempting to pursue international certification, actually represents a genuinely sound, methodical approach, rather than simply a convenient workaround for avoiding stricter Western regulatory scrutiny. Trust in aviation, whether we're talking about an airframe, an airline, or an engine specifically, has never been something that can be simply declared or marketed into existence. It has to be earned, one safely completed flight at a time, accumulated patiently across years and ultimately decades of consistent, unglamorous, reliable performance. Whether the CJ-2000 ultimately succeeds in earning that same level of trust the way Rolls-Royce, GE, and Pratt Whitney all eventually did, before it remains genuinely one of the more consequential open questions in commercial aviation today, and the answer likely won't become fully clear for at least another decade. Consider, finally, what a genuinely independent Chinese engine supply chain would actually mean for the countries currently sitting outside the traditional Western aviation sphere entirely. Large stretches of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia have historically struggled to access modern wide-body aircraft on favorable financing terms, often facing years-long waiting lists for Boeing and Airbus deliveries, or getting priced out of the newest, most fuel-efficient options entirely, and left operating older, less efficient second-hand aircraft instead. A certified, reliable Chinese wide-body option, backed by state financing and freed from Western export control restrictions, could realistically reshape aviation access across huge portions of the developing world within a single generation, offering airlines in those regions a genuine third path forward that simply didn't exist before. That outcome wouldn't just represent a shift in market share between competing manufacturers. It would represent a fundamental restructuring of who gets to fly on what terms and under whose technological and financial umbrella for millions of passengers who have never had a real alternative to the existing Boeing and Airbus duopoly at all.